From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I know that Susan was signing books before the event, so I'm sure that some of you have already met her, but for those of you who have not, Susan Jacoby is a historian and scholar who specializes in the history of atheism and secularism and freedom of religion, or more precisely, I think we could say freedom from religion. She is a board member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And she's an independent scholar, which I find fascinating. You're not affiliated with a university.
No.
And, and you don't have a PhD.
No.
So what that means to me as a journalist is I have great respect for people who tackle these complex historical subjects without an institutional support behind them or advanced study in libraries, because inevitably I think those books turn out a lot of esoteric knowledge and esoteric references that are often written to impress other academics. I can tell you that Susan Jacoby's writing is, I would guess because you are an independent scholar, very accessible, beautifully written, very friendly to a broad public audience. Susan is the author of several books, including Freethinkers, A History of American Secularism, The Age of American Unreason, The Great Agnostic, Robert Ingersoll and American Freethought, and Half Jew, A Daughter's Search for Her Family's Buried Past. And that's a story which is highly relevant to her latest book, which we're going to be discussing today, Strange Gods, A Secular History of Conversion. So, Susan, it's a real pleasure to meet you and have this opportunity to talk to you.
Likewise.
I want everyone to look at this. This is my copy of the book. And you know, sometimes interviews, I'll let you in on a secret. Sometimes interviews don't really read a book very thoroughly before they interview the author. You can see that I actually did read this, and it's covered with post-notes. It's a fascinating book. I love this book very much. It's really much more than a history of conversion. To me, Susan, it seems like it's really a history of intellectual thought over the past 2,000 years. It's a secular account of the history of religion in many ways. But you have focused it in this unusual way by looking specifically at religious conversions. So what is it that the study of conversions tells us?
Well, it tells us, first of all, what we all know from all sorts of things that are going on today, that religious conversion is a big driver of history. That whether you're talking about the triumph of Christianity over paganism in the declining Roman Empire, or for that matter, I should say this book is almost entirely about Western history, because otherwise it would have been 1,000 pages long instead of 600 pages
And it would have taken you more than 6 years to write.
Yeah, and I would say that that book would be best done by someone with a strong Hindu or Buddhist background. But it's a big driver of history and is always mixed up with political changes and other kinds of social changes. For example, I don't think that I think Christianity and the decline of the Roman Empire, and I don't share Gibbon's view that the decline of the Roman Empire was caused by Christianity, but the rise of new religions to provide something that pagan Roman society wasn't providing for people was very well linked to that. There were lots of conversions to Judaism, as I point out, in the declining Roman Empire too. And initially, of course, Romans regarded Christianity as just another form of Judaism. But so Christianity, obviously, the change from Catholic Europe to Christian Europe that included Protestantism, the Reformation, again, another huge change of, thing about religion as a driver of history.
These are really turning points in Western history.
These are turning points at the intersection of religion and politics. Look, you can certainly say that without the Reformation, it's quite possible that the United States would not have been settled in the way that it was at all. And I don't mean just by Puritans. I mean by people whom the Puritans were persecuting back home, but the Puritans didn't get to do it here because people just moved away from Massachusetts to New York and Pennsylvania. So that's one of the reasons I'm really interested in conversion. And then my family background makes me particularly interested. I see some people whom I know have read some of my earlier books. I was brought up a Catholic, and I didn't find out until I was about 17 that my father was born a Jew, and he was a convert to Catholicism. Now, I would have found this out much sooner had I not grown up in a small town where there were almost no Jews. If I'd lived in New York, I would have realized that Jacoby, if you go far back enough, is always a Jewish name. But I didn't. And my grandmother, when she married my grandfather, was a convert from Lutheranism to Catholicism, to please my grandfather's family. Can I tell my little story? Do I have time? About everyone then, this is 1919. I mean, nobody thinks that much of a conversion like that today. But in 1919, it was something. And they went to the priest to take instruction, as they called it, before their marriage. And he asked outright if my grandmother was in the family way. And my grandfather reared up and he said, "She's as innocent as the Virgin Mary, no thanks to me. All I've done is kiss her, and you have a dirty mind." And he wanted to go to a judge to get married, but my grandmother wouldn't let him because she thought his mother would be very upset. So apparently they went, as my grandmother told me the story, and found a more sympathetic priest with a less dirty mind.
So your father converted, and then his uncles, who obviously were Jewish as well, also converted, correct?
No, that was my father's brother who converted. My Uncle Ozzie, who was a famous bridge champion,
right,
also converted. He converted a little later in his life than my father did. He broke his back, and as my Uncle Ozzie, who was alive when I was writing my memoir, Half Jew, told me, he said, my Catholic wife pounced, and she thought I was dying, and so she got me to agree to being baptized. So
how do you explain those conversions? In other words, in what category would you put those conversions in your family?
I would put them in the two categories. One in the category, the biggest driver of conversion throughout history has been intermarriage. And by that, I emphasize, I don't mean that I consider those put-on conversions or false conversions. When people fall in love with someone of another faith, often they become interested in that religion. It's part of it, you become interested in what books another person reads or something like that. But in the case of my father's family, they were a family of German Jews, and like many German Jews, they were very secular in the 19th century. And I do know that my father's father was there was a lot of shame around being Jewish. And I don't think it's an accident when all three siblings in a family all marry Irish Catholics and convert, although they didn't really know anything about Judaism either. So I think there was both falling in love with someone of another faith, very common motivation, but also in the case of my father's family's attitude toward Judaism, my dad told me, I did ask my father about this, and he said, and this is how he regarded being a Jew. He said, "I didn't want you and your brother ever to think that if you didn't get something you wanted in life, it was because you were Jewish." That's one of the saddest things that my father ever said to me. Mm-hmm. So it was a combination of motives. But my father was also a compulsive gambler, and again, this is involved in many conversions, and it's both spiritual and non-spiritual in a way. My father felt that the rituals of religion, and why not become a Catholic? You're married to a Catholic, you have children being raised as Catholics. The rituals of religion would help him overcome gambling, just as George W. Bush felt that the religion he adopted would help him overcome alcoholism. Mm-hmm. And that too is a mixed kind of motive. So if you're asking, does this have anything to do with forced conversion in the sense of people doing it because they're going to have their property taken away or be killed?
Which has happened.
No, which is also another kind of conversion. But I would say it was a combination of mixed marriage and social opportunism.
Those are very practical motivations, aren't they?
Yes.
Now, you know, I think when a lot of us think of religious conversion, we think sort of the prototypical conversion is the one you have depicted. Well, this is an old painting.
Caravaggio depicted it. I wish.
Right. But it's Saul of Tarsus, who is on his way on the road to Damascus, and he sees a light, and he becomes convinced that Jesus Christ has spoken to him, and from that moment on, he becomes Paul. And that's the most famous conversion of all. Now, in this painting, he's depicted as falling off a horse, which I don't think is in the Bible, actually.
No,
you basically
it's that he had a blow. It's that he had a blow on the head. It is, however, as it has been depicted by artists, and the Bible does say he woke up on the ground.
Yes.
So that would imply a fall.
Yeah.
And what else would he have been going to Damascus to? There are only three ways to get from Damascus to Jerusalem and vice versa. One is on foot, which I don't think he was, because he was going to ferret out Christians in Damascus to report them back to the high priest in Jerusalem.
And whether he fell off a horse or was struck by, something that was more inspiring than a blow on the head, still we think of this as being a conversion, a true spiritual conversion, that he was spoken to by God or Christ, and as a result of that experience, he became a Christian. But so that would not be in the category of an opportunistic.
Well, he became a follower of the way. Nobody used the word Christian.
Okay, all right. But you say in your book that it's only a tiny slice of converts throughout Western history who have converted for emotional reasons. So you should defend that statement, because that's quite a sweeping statement.
Well, I should have said purely spiritual reasons.
Okay.
And I meant that for purely spiritual reasons. I don't mean, in my view, the spiritual or the emotional, and I'm using them interchangeably, and I think they are, because when you read there are many other conversions like Saul's throughout history, and when you read about it, it's always as a highly emotional overnight experience. But I don't think, since conversions, when you're talking about large numbers of conversions, they tend to occur at great times of social upheaval. Mm-hmm. They tend to occur in societies which the late Roman Empire was, that were, except during certain epochs, we've heard about Nero's persecutions and Diocletian's, but they tend to occur, and I think that's one reason America has so much conversion, they tend to occur in societies where it's possible, even though it may become impossible and they may be persecuted eventually. So I defend that statement by saying that what I said was purely spiritual. I don't say that spiritual motivation isn't important. I think, as I said, I think that for my father, the desire to overcome a personal fault, I would call that a spiritual motivation. But as far as people in general, no, do I think that Ivanka Trump, for instance, who converted because she married a Jew, fell in love with him, do I think that Ivanka woke up one morning and said, oh, I've been wrong all these years, Jesus isn't the Messiah, I really believe in Judaism? No, she fell in love with, and maybe undoubtedly became genuinely interested in Judaism. So I don't think that I would defend my statement by saying that I don't think that it's impossible or even unlikely to have both spiritual and non-spiritual motives.
Well, we'll get back to some individual cases, but as I said before, one of the things that I found most fascinating about your book is that by talking about conversions, you really illuminate history, and you illuminate these turning points of history and these great changes in history. Talk a little bit about the growth of early Christendom in the declining Roman Empire and sort of the triumph over paganism, and how that happened, how that great wave of conversion, which was really the first big conversion that you write about in your book.
Right. Well, first of all, it didn't happen overnight. There were lots of religions competing with paganism in the late Roman Empire. Judaism was one of them. People don't realize that because Judaism isn't an active proselytizing religion. And Manichaeism, which Augustine of Hippo was originally attracted to, was another one. And certainly things could have turned out differently, and it could have won out instead of Christianity. But one thing that happened in the late Roman Empire was a lot of Romans, particularly well-off Romans, were disgusted by the decadence of Roman society. And both Judaism and Christianity, and that's why ascetic movements too were, which Christianity wasn't nearly as extreme in as certain forms of Manichaeism were. So they were attracted to something that seemed to offer a purpose and an explanation. And then at the same time, in the 4th century, which is really when Christianity begins to triumph, early 5th century, the Vandals and the Goths overrun Rome. And a lot of wealthy Romans became refugees in North Africa. They brought with them their money to the church. And money was very important in that they attracted. Christianity was not only the religion of the poor, but it became the religion of choice. Ultimately, certainly the emperors Constantine and Theodosius. When your emperor picks Christianity, that also encourages the upper classes. Again, it's a mixture of things. Notice I'm talking about attraction to a religion that seemed to offer more spiritually than paganism. But at the same time, you're talking about a religion that your emperor was picking. Constantine opened up the civil service to Christians. You didn't have to, after Constantine, you didn't have to give up your job in the Roman civil service if you wanted to become a Christian. So I think these things.
So it became, at a certain point, then it became advantageous to convert to Christianity.
At certain points in parts of the Roman Empire, it became advantageous, and certainly by the early 5th century, mid-5th century, it was settled. Christianity won out, Manichaeanism lost out, and then you begin to have anti-Semitism of a level that had not existed in the Roman Empire before.
And once Christianity had established this foothold, not only in Europe, but as you say, in North Africa, it actually took on a more aggressive form, you write about. And actually, Christians themselves, having been persecuted in the early stages of Christendom, became persecutors, you say.
Yes, and also different sects within Christianity became persecutors of each other, too. Arguing over whether the Roman Church was going to survive or whether the forms which were more native to North Africa, and that of course the East-West split in Christianity, Catholicism continues to this day. But the thing that happened in the Roman Empire, it was not unusual. It's once the church and the state got together, what situation has there ever been in history when the church has had at its disposal the power of the state to enforce its belief? And by the church, I just mean churches. Just as in John Calvin's Geneva became a theocracy every bit as bad as theocratic Spain and Portugal during the Inquisition. There is no incidence in history of a theocracy which has practiced religious tolerance and freedom of religion. Forget freedom from religion, which is freedom from religion and freedom of religion are integrally linked. They have to be. There has been no theocratic society which has ever been tolerant of other religions. It wouldn't, by definition, be a theocratic society.
Now, you mentioned the Inquisition, and of course, that is kind of the prototypical period where Christians persecuted Jews and Muslims and forbid. You talk about the expulsion order when Jews and Muslims were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula unless they converted to Christianity. But prior to the Inquisition, there was this period that's called the Convivencia, where you actually had Islam, Judaism, and Christianity coexisting relatively peacefully. What happened?
well, what happened was the Reconquista. When the Christians retook all of Spain, the Muslim rulers were tolerant of the right of Jews. They called themselves people of the book. They weren't tolerant of pagans, however. But they were, the three monotheistic religions pretty much coexisted. And we know, here's my intermarriage, not theory, I think, theory in the sense of Einstein's theory of relativity, but we know there was a lot of intermarriage during the convivencia. How do we know this? Because there was a massive DNA study done of people on the Iberian Peninsula. It was completed about 10 years ago. Found out that 20% of all residents of Spain today possess Sephardic Jewish genes due to DNA analysis, and almost 15% possess North African Muslim genes. Now, obviously, this means there was a lot of fooling around right from the start, whatever people thought about it. And as happens when people of different religions have a fair amount of political equality, which they did. Jews and Christians weren't quite equal under Muslim rulers, but they were fairly equal. They weren't persecuted for their religion.
But you had this period of coexistence, which is sadly not very common throughout Western history. Whom do you credit for that? Do you credit, it sounds like you credit them, there were Muslim rulers, but there were also Christian monarchs. Alfonso X was...
yes, yeah. There were Christian monarchs who didn't share Ferdinand and Isabella's views. They weren't like, they did business, and not only that, but during the convivencia in Spain, this is the Dark Ages in Northern Europe, but in the convivencia, the Arabs had translated many of the Greek classics, which were lost in Northern Europe at that time, except in monasteries. They weren't available to an educated person who was interested in the classical heritage. Well, they had been translated into Arabic by the Arabs, and contact between Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the convivencia in Spain was such that they then got retranslated back into Latin.
Thanks to the Arabs.
Thanks to the Arabs, thanks to the fact that there was, and eventually retranslated a few centuries later into the emerging vernaculars of Europe.
Yeah. Well, it's an important thing to remember now because there's so much animosity between Islam and Christianity that there was this period where it was the Muslims who were the most civilized and enlightened in that part of Europe. This sounds like what you're saying.
At that point in Europe, yes.
Yeah. Now, and then we get to the Protestant Reformation, another one of these great turning points that is itself a story of conversions. And you write the spread of vernacular Bibles, the translation of the Bible into German and other vernacular languages, allowed every literate person direct access to the scriptures without the mediation of priests. And of course, Martin Luther was instrumental in that. He translated the New Testament into German himself, and he was obviously a big advocate of bypassing priests and encouraging direct contact, communication with God. And you write, between roughly 1517 and 1550, huge numbers of Europeans changed their minds about what constituted the foundation of their lives, encompassing their view of the universe, of relations between God and man, and of the proper way for individual human beings to seek truth. So talk a little bit about that, because that, on the one hand, that is obviously politically very important, but it sounds like it had a lot of spiritual significance as well, because it really changed the way people, as you say, saw their relation to God. That's a pretty spiritual development.
They saw their relation to God as wanting a more direct relationship with God, which is, again, a religious issue that's still with us in America today. Protestantism, because it encouraged reading in the vernacular, involved a more direct relationship to God. But of course, it didn't take very long, less than 100 years, before there became new kinds of Protestants whom the first Protestant reformers, the Lutherans and the Calvinists, didn't like. And they were the nonconformist Protestants. the Baptists, the Quakers, the Anabaptists, the Anabaptists, the Huguenots, many of whom our own founders were descended from, which I didn't know until I wrote Freethinkers, that a lot of our founders, their grandparents were Huguenot refugees from France, where but it was not only the Catholic Church that objected to Huguenots under Louis XIV, but the magisterial Protestants, as they're called, the first ones, the Lutherans and the Calvinists, they also objected to nonconformist Protestants. Quakers were persecuted in England. That's how a lot of them wound up founding Pennsylvania.
But let's stick for a moment on the early period of the Reformation. Those people who became Protestants, who converted from Catholicism to Protestantism as a result of the translation of the Bible, would you consider those to be spiritual conversions or opportunistic conversions?
I would say, except for the very first ones, mostly both. Spiritual in the sense that that the chance to read these things and also probably the vernacular translations encouraged people to read, more people to learn to read who wouldn't have otherwise. We know that the rate of literacy in Europe in Protestant countries was higher than in Catholic countries at that time. But I would say both. There's always a tipping point once your ruler adopts a religion, when something becomes both pragmatically desirable as well as spiritually. Mm-hmm. But I would say both. But the first magisterial Protestants, I mean, Calvin's Geneva was a pit of horror, with basically secret police monitoring every home, having, exactly like Stalin's Communist Party, having rules that governed every aspect of life. Can't have more than 16 people over for dinner. There was no reason for that, except they just were so opposed to fun of every kind that maybe they thought too much fun was being had if there were more than 16 people there.
And as you say, it was precisely at that moment of religious persecution in Europe among these rival sects that the United States was founded. And you make a very interesting connection between our tradition of religious liberty and the birth of the United States under Enlightenment influences with what was going on in Europe at that time.
Well, look, when you think, jump ahead a little bit from the 17th century, where our first colonists arrived, and as we know, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was not religiously tolerant at all. The difference between America and Europe was that people who dissented, they didn't get killed there necessarily. They left for New York. The Salem witch trials happened at the point where the Massachusetts theocracy was breaking down, as my friend Stacy Schiff has written, and that's very true. But the founders, when they write the Constitution, it's less than 100 years after Protestants and Catholics and Protestants were murdering each other in Europe over such earth-shaking issues as, is it okay to baptize babies, or do you need to wait for adult baptism? This was one of the major sources of many religious wars in Europe. And when you think about the founders, all having a state religion meant to them was the kind of trouble. They were all educated men. All of them were educated. Probably the most educated group of people founding a country who ever existed. What having a state religion meant to them was the mess that was in Europe. And so that's why they wrote the Constitution, first of all, prohibiting any religious test for public office, and the First Amendment the way they did. They saw absolutely no value in having a state religion, and a lot that was wrong. I mean, one of the most exciting things, reading from before the Revolution, 1767, the end of the French and Indian War in New York, they had a big celebration to commemorate the victory, the British victory, French and Indian, in the war. All of the churches and the only synagogue in Manhattan were allowed to participate in this and read their sermons of Thanksgiving and so on. Now, this would have been absolutely unthinkable in Europe, that a synagogue would have been included in this. So that the seeds that came to fruition in the Constitution so shortly afterwards, were already there in colonial America.
Okay, I've taken enough of Susan's time. This is your turn now we didn't really get into 20th century America, which
Not at all.
Which is another whole great story of conversions in the United States. But anyone have any questions for Susan Jacoby? Sorry, yes.
Sure.
There are 2 mics, one in each aisle here, if you would be so kind, so we can hear you, and everybody can hear you.
Hi, thank you. That was fascinating, and I feel like I want to replay the video and absorb it some more. You bring this extraordinary sense of how religion affects geopolitics and, frankly, war. If you, a bit wishful thinking, but if you could wave a magic wand or whatever, or counsel the UN, how would you address the Middle East crisis and these? No, but seriously, because these are religious wars. These are ultimately religious wars. That's really what they boil down to: Arabs versus Jews, etc. And how would you counsel them to structure some of these deals to address the tolerance of the given religions in a way that can be a resolution?
I can't believe you asked me that. But I'm just going to answer honestly and not try and give you nonsense. I do not think that the situation in the Middle East is anything but containable. The advice I would give anyone who was in charge of our country was just as you couldn't, quote, win the Cold War, an idea I hate. There is no way with a certain proportion of people in that region of the world whose minds are stuck in the 8th century, and a certain proportion of people in Israel whose minds are still stuck in 18th century Poland and Russia. But the difference is that Israel isn't going out and, Israel is a whole other question. But I don't think that the situation in the Middle East is anything but containable in the sense of preventing people from murdering their neighbors, which obviously we haven't succeeded in doing either. And I don't think it will be anything but containable as long as there is this segment of Islam, both the terrorist and theocratic states like Saudi Arabia, who, by the way, not only persecute Christians and not only hate Jews, but persecute freethinkers who blog about things like freedom of religion and other Muslims who don't agree with their view of Islam also. So I don't have an answer for that. I don't feel optimistic.
Yeah, evidently. You, sir.
Right. I just have a quick question on your feelings about our government's protection of apostates from different groups.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Apostates.
Oh.
Could you clarify
I don't
when you
quite
say of
know
different
what the
of different groups? You mean overseas?
All the various ones. I mean, Muslims usually are on everybody's minds, but I'm thinking also of Mormons and Scientologists and the terrible things they do to the people that wish to leave.
You mean wish to leave their sects, their religions? I don't see that our government protects Mormons. Mormons placed like many religions, like Hasidic Jews, for example, also. Anyone, and I have done a lot of interviewing of people who have left the kinds of religious sects that try to control every aspect of daily life, which not all Mormons are like. But I don't see that our government protects them.
I think he's wondering if they should do more to protect people who want to leave.
Well, I don't. First of all, I know a lot of people who have left. I'm only speaking now of America. I know a lot of people who have left the Mormon Church. They used to come to our Center for Inquiry meetings. I know a lot of people who have left Satmar and Lubavitcher Hasidic Judaism. And there was tremendous social pressure placed on them, but I don't know what our government could do to make you exercise freedom of conscience. It's very painful. Some of the most painful interviews I have ever had have been with these people and what they went through, because they were not just leaving their religion, they were, in most cases, leaving their families and the only world they've ever known. But I don't think there's anything government could do. The government has done one thing it can do. Our government has never, for example, honored, as many ultra-Orthodox Jews try to prevent women from getting a divorce by not giving them a religious divorce. Our courts have always said that religious divorce, laws governing religious marriage and religious laws have no civil standing. In other words, you're divorced according to the laws of whatever state you live in, whether your husband gives you a get or not. But what our government could do, much less should do, about giving a woman the courage to forsake a religion that says only a man can grant a divorce, I don't really see what our government could do. One thing I think that it should do is I think we should be much tougher, have many fewer religious exemptions for things regarding medical procedures and vaccination. And this is still a problem, even though it's not as bad as it was only 10 years ago, because medical custody can be taken away from parents who deny life-saving standard medical care to their children. But that's the only place I think that the government could effectively act.
Let me ask you a question, since there's nobody at the mic right now. You write, you do not consider any form of secular thought a religion unless the secular ideology possesses a civil enforcement mechanism. I'm sure you know there's been a big debate in this country around separation of church and state, that in fact secularism does have the status of a religion, and when the United States forbids, for example, when the US government forbids Bible reading in schools, it's actually enforcing secularism to the disadvantage of other religions. This was an argument that Potter Stewart made in the 1960s in the Supreme Court.
Yes, and I think it's a wrong argument, because the purpose of public schools is not to teach or foster religion. Not to say that when America was an entirely Protestant country, it wasn't taken very for granted. To study, let's say, the Bible, or to recite prayers, Christian prayers originating, or to recite prayers to God, that affects all children who are not of the majority religion. And I'll say something else also, and this is for not everybody here is an atheist or an agnostic. I think a lot of this idea that the government is enforcing secularism by not allowing religion in that kind of a public space is particularly important, is in a way a confession on the part of some religious people of the ineffectiveness of religion. Because if there is anything, it seems to me, it's the obligation of a parent to do, it is to try and pass on what you believe, as I don't have children. But if I did, I don't, for example, understand how someone, I know, for example, an atheist who is married to a devout Catholic. And they both tell their children what they think. And I can't understand that, because to me, a person's religious beliefs are deeply important. And while I have lots of friends who are observant Catholics and Jews and Protestants, I would find it impossible to raise a child to believe, for example, in the virgin birth and all of that.
Or to make up his or her own mind.
Or children can make up their own minds. They will eventually, whatever you do. But I would not want to see my child, in any case, I think it is the function of the church and the family to pass on their religious beliefs to the next generation. It is not the function of a public school. And I don't think that makes secularism a religion, because not studying, say, the Christian Bible or the Hebrew Bible or the Quran is not saying that those things aren't good. It is saying that we don't teach this in school. I don't teach, for example, but what else isn't taught in school? It's the function of the home. To some extent, in school you may teach people about sexual anatomy, but you may not tell them whether you should or you shouldn't use birth control. That's not anything I think that is the function of a school, unless it's a medical clinic for teenagers who come and ask.
Well, that's a hot button subject. I don't know if we want to go there.
No, but it's related to religion.
Right, yeah. Sir, we have just a few minutes left, so
In recent
we have
times,
2 minutes left.
there's been a rather dramatic decrease in the adherence to Christianity in Europe. I'm just curious about your perspective on the reasons for that.
Well, I think actually, there's been actually a fairly dramatic decrease in America too. It doesn't mean they're not religious, but 25% of Americans, almost 25% now say that religion no longer plays an important role in their daily lives, and that they're not, doesn't mean they're atheists again, and that they're not members of any church. I think this process is far more advanced in Europe because of Europe's history of religious persecution and separation of church and state. Europeans who leave their default church, Catholicism in Southern Europe, Protestantism in Northern Europe, tend to go straight to secularism. In other words, you don't get very many Lutherans in Germany, in the Lutheran part of Germany, converting to Catholicism. You don't get very many Catholics in Italy converting to Judaism or Wiccanism or Islam or whatever. They go straight to secularism, but that's because I think that if you come from a country with a history of religious persecution, you tend not to be as eager as Americans are to substitute one religion for another. I mean, look at Europeans. Americans often, they're mixed couples who choose a third religion, like Senator Harry Reid and his wife, who was an Orthodox Jewish family. He was raised a Protestant. They decided to choose Mormonism as a third way when they got married. Now, I think, frankly, this did have something to do with the fact that there's a large Mormon vote in Nevada, and Harry Reid was a budding politician. But even if there weren't politics involved, that would seem insane to most of the Europeans I know, whatever their religion is, that you just go out and pluck a third religion, out of the air,
Well, listen, we've only scratched the surface of this subject.
This is the best interview I've ever had.
Thank you.
It really...
But there's so much more. There's so much more in this book. It's really a fascinating book. It covers so much territory. Susan took many years to write it. So thank you so much. It's been great. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Susan Jacoby.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.